As there were commandments concerning the sacrifice at the altar of burnt offering, one may begin to wonder about slaughtering meat for consumption. The Israelites were to pour the blood out and cover it with dirt. If a domesticated animal was found in the field, torn apart by wild animals, its meat was not to be eaten. As mentioned before, livestock that died naturally was ritualistically impure. The dietary implications is that only the meat from ritualistically slaughtered animals was to be consumed. The sexual immorality of Egypt and Canaan were not to be done by the Israelites. Per Leviticus 18:8, 10, and 15, any Israelite that had sexual relations with their father, mother, stepmother, daughter, grandson, or granddaughter were to be condemned to death. Incestuous relationships between a man and his father, mother, stepmother, and daughter-in-law were punishable by death by stoning, while incestuous relationships between a man and his daughter, grandson, or granddaughter were punishable by death, or punishable with death by burning. There was another level of sexual immorality that was covered under the fifth commandment in Exodus 20. If a man has sexual relations with a woman and her daughter, he would have caused the daughter to dishonor her father and mother. Moreover, the Israelites were forbidden from having sexual relations with their parental aunt, maternal aunt, parental aunt through marriage, paternal uncle, one's sister-in-law, Leviticus 18, 12 through 14, 16, and 18. However, sexual relations with one's sister-in-law were permissible under Levirate marriage. This prohibition was not only random Israelite women, but also with a man's female relatives. Leviticus 18:6. Per Leviticus 18:19 through 20, a Israelite man was not to approach a woman in order to have sexual relations with her while she was on her menstrual cycle, nor commit adultery. You are not to let any of your children be sacrificed to Molech, thereby profaning the name of your God. I am Adonai. Leviticus 18:21. Who was Molech? The Ammonites nationally worshipped an idol by the name of Milcom. Milcai is a variant of Milcom. When combined with the name Adad, Milki becomes Adad Milki. Adad, however, is an Assyrian and Babylonian variant of the Canaanite name Hadad. The Canaanites also worshipped an idol by the name of Hadad, who allegedly had power over storms and rain. The Armenians worshipped Hadad as a variation of Baal, a Phoenician and Ugaritic word for Lord or King. In Hebrew, this word is Melech. The word Melech is very similar to the word Molech. Therefore, it seemed that the idol Molech was a variation of Adad Milki, which is often translated as Aratamelech, or Adaramelech. Leviticus 17:8 through 18:21. Even though their ancestors came up from Egypt, they were no different from the Philistines, who were from Kephator or Aram, who came from Kerf or Ker. For its sins, Adonai would completely eradicate the kingdom of Samaria. shaking it and dispersing them among all the Gentiles as grains are strained through a sieve. This was done to purify the sinners who thought they would escape judgment. The time would come when the fallen tabernacle of David would be raised up and restored. The land would be bountiful and the fortunes replenished. The cities would be rebuilt and gardens and vineyards planted. Once it was restored, what would be left of the Gentile nations and Edom would be overtaken. Amos 9:15 sums up what the restoration would be like by these words stated by the King of the universe. I will plant them on their own soil, no more to be uprooted from their land, which I gave them. Amos 9:7-15. Paul would refuse to speak to these, or that the king wills him to visit again, but would take note of their influence. He not only questioned if he will come there peacefully or correct them himself, but also addressed the metropolis about a particular Christian engaging in sins that were taboo from the perspective of the pagans, and that an excommunication be issued against him. Paul hoped that by the metropolis doing so, that the man would repent outside of communion so that his soul could be saved in the end. Transitioning to the arrogant pride of the metropolis, Paul used the Jewish bread-making techniques and Pesach customs as an example of how arrogant pride can fester and poison the faith. On Nisan the 13th, all observant Jewish families look for hummus or yeast and remove it so they can only make unleavened bread and dough from Nisan 15th to the 21st per Exodus 12:21 through 51, 13:17 through 15:26, Leviticus 22:26 through 23:44, and Deuteronomy 15:19 through 16:17. Hummus is also a symbol of arrogant pride. Paul instructed the metropolis to remove the old arrogant pride as Christians through Christ, who is the true and sacrificed paschal lamb, are unleavened in reality. In Jewish bread making, a piece of hummus from one batch of dough is used to ferment other batches of dough. This could increase the risk of food contamination, which shows that arrogant pride can poison a person's faith. Therefore, the Christian should remove all traces of arrogant pride, the yeast of wickedness and evil, for his spiritual health. He must instead mediate and spiritually consume the matzah of purity and truth. Transitioning to the sexual immorality, drunkenness, abusiveness, greed, theft, and idolatry practiced in the metropolis by alleged Christians, Paul instructed devout Christians not to do anything to do with them, or to not have anything to do with them. The metropolis was supported by Deuteronomy 13:6 or verse 5, 17:7, 12, 19:19, 21:21, 22:21, 24, and 24:7, instructed to not judge the sinner by the same standard as the Christian. Expounding on this, Paul instructed that the Christian should bring his complaint against another before the elders and presbyter of his parish instead of the secular court system. As all the redeemed will judge fallen angels, they should be able to judge in matters of the everyday life of the Christian. 1 Corinthians 5, 1 through 13. Paul, initially wanting peace between them and himself, wrote the metropolis 2 letters. He hoped that these 2 letters would aim them in electing the right course of righteous conduct. However, like our Father who has exhausted his patience, knows that he must correct these Christians as a child needs to be corrected. He states that if anyone has harmed them in words, it has been a man in the metropolis whose name is not worth mentioning. As this man has repented, he has not been forgiven, encouraged, or comforted by the bishops or the presbytery. When Paul wrote them, he wanted to test them to see if they would forgive just as easily as they would judge, so they would not be taken advantage of by dark supernatural forces. 2 Corinthians 2, 1 through 11.